So everyone, I'd like to welcome you all to this fourth session of the Data-Driven Queuing Challenges workshop. My name is Peter Taylor. I'm actually coming to you from the city of Melbourne in Australia, where we had the interesting experience of having a small earthquake today. It was only a small one, but it's the biggest one that's ever happened in my lifetime. So there you go. I'm actually sitting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd just like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And indeed, I'd like to pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of country, wherever anyone's watching this, in Australia or even internationally. It's my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce you today Avishai Mandelbaum. For people in the stochastic operations research community, I don't think Avi really needs any introduction at all. He's an absolute giant of the field. He's one of the first people who actually pointed out that we should look at data and how to handle it. And you just look at the people that he's influenced, even in the speakers list for this workshop, and you see what his effect has been on the field. So I think we're actually very lucky that Avi's agreed to speak to us, and he's going to tell us about resource-driven activity networks. And Avi, I'm going to hand over the screen to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the organizers for inviting me and to this wonderful and timely workshop. I'll be talking about resource-driven activity networks, which we call RANs for short. This is a family of models, or perhaps even a modeling framework that started in a research proposal with Armony and Petar Momcilovic, then continued in a PhD by Nitzan Carmeli, that was advised also by Galit Yom-Tov, who joined later. Today's talk is based on a paper that is now being prepared that went through a lot of rethinking and developing of the proposal and the thesis. And also, I'll mention some research on appointments to large-scale service systems that is now ongoing with Junfei, Petar, and Nikos Trikakis. This is my planned outline. The gap between the plan and the actual is a central theme in my models. So I hope that the shoemaker will not go barefoot. I'll start personal, make some comments about how I started this research some years ago, research on RANs. Then I'll make additional comments on how what I do relates to our present turbulent times. Then I'll be focusing on the two prerequisites from our research, data and models, and I'll end with conclusions as time permits. So personal history. My first academic job was at Stanford, and in hindsight, the research I did then prepared me perfectly for RAN research. I worked on database queuing networks. I learned about closed and open generalized Jackson networks, and I was fortunate to collaborate with Mike Harrison on what is now called stochastic processing networks. That is modeling paradigm that extends queuing networks to input-output systems in a way that will become clear when I introduce you to RANs later on. Now, this research was born in Harrison's seminal paper, Brownian Models of Queuing Networks with Heterogeneous Customer Populations. And the first sentence in that paper reads as follows. In the future paper 8, a class of crude but relatively tractable stochastic system models called Brownian networks will be systematically discussed. Now here is the articulation of the dynamics of those Brownian networks. And you see that this is a linear system with some conic constraints. And those Brownian networks, or SPNs, have three building blocks: resources, activities, and stocks. Now, what is this paper 8? 8 is a joint paper, my paper with Harrison, that was in preparation at the time, but it has never been written. And the reason is because I was simply not mature enough then to write such a paper. Now, fortunately, 35 years later, I think that run forced me to become mature. And like I said, this research here and everything that emerged from that prepared me to do this research. Now, this is the analog of what you see here for RANs. Again, there are linear constraints plus an conic constraint, but RANs have only two building blocks: resources and activities. And of course, I shall explain that more carefully later on. So let me start with one of the prerequisites and then move on to the other: data. So data is language and often prerequisites for partnerships between academia and industry, which I really needed because I use lots of data in my research. It's a language of multidisciplinary research, and it gives relevance and helps us learn about relevance of our models and their applications. Here is the type of data that I'm using. What you see here is 61 visits by a patient to a cancer center in the United States. This is a data partner, a very important data partner of our lab at the Technion. It's the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. They're allowing us to tell who they are. We write papers together, and both of us are proud of this partnership. So what you see here is 61 visits. Each vertical line is a visits. And a full visit consists of waiting for blood test, waiting for a doctor exam and a doctor exam. And if the blood test and the exam succeeded, then there is treatment, chemotherapy or infusion. So you can see actually the patient moving, and that's data animation of those 61 paths. Now, it also gives me an opportunity to explain what you see. So this is actually a picture with activities on arcs. You see, if you are here waiting for a doctor, and this is the doctor's visit itself, then when the circle, which is the patient, is in between, it means that they're waiting. When they reach this one, this point here, the visit, then here, as long as this circle is moving here, then it means that the patient is within the doctor's office and being in the middle of the visit. Okay, so you can see that those visits differ. Some of them are full and some of them are only partial, in the sense that there's only a doctor's visit or sometimes only a treatment. Okay, and what actually arranged this is an optimizer that was developed in my lab. And actually, this animation is an animation that was that is based on tools that were developed at the lab. So everything that you'll see later on, except for one that I'll point to, is based on tools that were developed at the SEELab at the Technion. So you can see that there is an optimizer that arranged those paths in a way that will be convenient to read, to look, and to understand. And in fact, this optimizer unknowingly clustered the visits according to their types: full visits and these types of visits. Okay. So 61 visits of a single patient over a 6-month period at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Now you can think about, or you can contemplate the challenges that are required to overcome in order to control such an operation during COVID time. How do you maintain spatial distancing in that operation? And those constraints are taken very, very seriously in the hospital, because the patients are high-risk patients. And so all the rules are maintained very, very strictly. So they were actually controlling the number of escorts that patients can bring to the premise. They added queues, so patients will not queue up and they'll not be close to each other. They would tell patients, for example, to go to the cafeteria if they foresaw that the queue is really a little too long downstream. They were delaying the lab, they were delaying the exam, and they were controlling in real time everything that they could in order to maintain spatial distancing constraints. And in the background, there were actually fundamental changes taking place in the channel mix and in the supply chain of the hospital, and possibly irreversibly. And let me explain what I mean by that. March 10 to 15 was the week where COVID constraints were applied in Massachusetts. So what you see here in green is the number of appointments made to Dana-Farber. What you see in blue is the number of appointments that materialized, those that were registered in the hospital. And in March, this actually divided. The number of appointments was reduced to about 50%, but it has increased steadily, and now it's more or less where it was pre-COVID. But the in-hospital visits was reduced to about 50% of the total. And there is a new type of visits, which are phone visits that hardly existed before. So as you can see, the operation is now very different than what it used to be pre-COVID. And these changes have actually taken place in most service operations. So even in call centers, which looked like this before COVID, they're now much less crowded. People use virtual centers, allowing workers to work from home. People use voice bots in order to reduce the staffing levels, and so on and so on. And taking COVID constraints or the COVID reality to the extreme, here is a picture from a hospital in China. At 6 a.m. in the morning. It's a good hospital in Beijing. And the reason that the queue was so long and so crowded is due to the Chinese culture in healthcare. So behavior in the healthcare system before COVID was based on the following principles. There were hardly any physicians, primary physicians or family doctors. So patients, if you needed an eye doctor, you would go to the eye doctor at the hospital that you preferred. Now, the culture is the same like we have here in Israel, only the best doctor for me. So your top priority is the best hospital. And there were hardly any appointments made. So for example, in a partner hospital in Shenzhen that I know about, there were less than 1% of arrivals to the hospital via appointments. What happened after COVID? Well, the number of appointments in that hospital increased in 2020 to 35% and in 2021 to 65%. And my friends in China before COVID told me that there's no way in the world that such a thing can happen. And there's lots of reliance on telemedicine. For example, there are over 1,100 internet hospitals that were created during the last 2 years, and they are becoming more and more popular. So obviously we're going through transformational changes. And this raises naturally the question of OR, OM, i.e. Quo Vadis. Now, I'm old enough to have experienced this question being asked at least twice. In the 70s and 80s, where Japanese took over the manufacturing or started to dominate the manufacturing world, the same questions were asked about OR, OM, i.e. practices and models. And then when digital markets emerged, economists asked themselves the same question. Should new theories be developed? Maybe the old ones prevail, or maybe just enhancing the old one will do. And these are the type of questions that, of course, we are all asking ourselves nowadays. So here's an example of a theory that can be enhanced, and maybe some new theory must be developed. So this is appointment scheduling at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So traditionally, the research area of appointment scheduling has been mostly single server theory. But here we need appointments of many servers, because if you want to make appointments to infusion beds, for example, in one floor, 9th floor, then you have tens of customers, you have 25 or more ID servers, which are the beds, and you need to develop models that trade off delay versus overtime costs that go beyond the single server paradigm. By the way, this is the 9th floor, and if I click here, I hope that I'll be actually getting to a YouTube animation. And that's something that you can actually do when you read the paper. When you look at the graphic paper, then you get to such animations that show you what happens on the 9th floor. There are about 26 infusion beds here, and you see the patients in the beds. Okay. Good. So the research with Petar and Nikos that was published in Management Science was data-based. And we developed infinite server approximations that allowed us to produce appointments. The models were validated, they turned out to be accurate, and computations were quite easy. It led, at least on paper, to 30% cost reduction in delay costs and overtime costs. And we almost got to carry out a pilot, but the corona actually stopped these efforts. Now, as importantly, this research also planted the seeds for a theory of QED appointments or appointments to large queuing systems. And let me show you an environment or an operation that really requires such a theory. So this theory has been developed jointly with Junfei Wang, and the service system that I'm just showing you here, the data from that service system is the national park system in Israel. So today one must make reservations when one wants to visit a national park in Israel. This did not happen. This was not a requirement prior to Corona. And what you see here, starting from May 2020, the number of appointments, the number of canceled appointments, and as you can see, the number of daily appointments is 80,000 for a total of 70 parks. So per popular park, it could reach about 2,000 per day. And in fact, that's a small number when you compare it, for example, to Yosemite, where you have there up to about 20,000 visitors per day or about 5,000 cars per day before heavy congestion starts to build up. So these are large numbers. And if you want to develop appointment systems for these for such large numbers, you obviously need to go way beyond the single server theory. And that's what I call here QED appointments theory. Here's an example where all tricks actually worked. This data is taken from a hospital here in Tel Aviv in Are about the periodic checkup operation in that hospital, where patients are coming and are doing periodic checkups, for example, ear exams, eye exams, stress tests, et cetera. And those exams can be carried out in any order that you wish. So the system looks like that. It's like a job shop. There is a dispatcher that sends the patients to the various stations according to what the state of the system is at the time. Okay, so this model is actually, when you look to model this system, it's actually a star network that was developed in the 60s to describe time-sharing computer systems. And when you adopt this system to the reality of humans, then, as was pointed out by Baron et al. In 2014, a natural service level to maintain is the minimum of the maximal queue or waiting throughout the path. So when you experience several waitings, what you carry with you when you go home is the longest wait or the longest queue. So this is what we would like to minimize, the maximal wait. And when you try to do that, then you're led into strategies that are in fact idling, because you don't want to send a patient, or you don't want to serve a patient if you know that downstream this patient is going to experience a very long wait. You might as well let the patient wait now and then wait less later, so that the maximum of the two waits will be smaller. This research is now being continued with Manloop, that's a PhD, and other colleagues with an added IT angle. And there's in fact a serendipity to this research, because by controlling the maximal weight, you in fact can control COVID constraints, because min-max of the micro queue, individual queue, is associated with spatial distancing. And waiting for a little time is also helping you avoid infection. So this performance measure that was developed a few years ago, in fact, is a natural one to look at when you wish to adhere to COVID constraints. Okay, let me show you a little of the data sources that we are using at the Technion SEELab, which is my my data home. The lab was founded in 2007 by a generous donation of a Technion friend, and it's presently run by two young researchers, Galit Yom-Tov and Yair Goldberg. These are examples of data collection technologies that have evolved over the years since around 2000. We used telephone systems, ACDs, automatic call distributors, CRM systems, hospital information system, etc. But I would like to focus on one particular data collection technology, RTLS or real-time location systems, because it shows you the power of those technologies. So here is the 9th floor of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And this is a large operation. It caters to about 900 to 1,000 patients per day. There are about 300 to 400 doctors and nurses. They actually move across 8 clinical floors, and there are about 900 real-time location system sensors, which are located here. And they record exact location every 3 seconds, which amounts to about 1 gigabyte of data per week. We have their data, by the way, since about 2015. So what you see here, for example, from the left, the hospital opens up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then this is where the blood test takes place, and then the patients start spreading over the disease centers over the 8 floors. Starting from the left, each such circle corresponds to a patient according to the dynamic rules that I explained to you before. And you can also monitor the doctors. And you can see doctors within each floor, and you can see how they move from floor to floor, which is something, by the way, that Dana-Farber would like to avoid. They would like the doctors to remain within floors because it's better for all sides. What you see here is the whole hospital. And of course, I'm not intending for you to see the details. I just want to impress upon you the level of details that we can get. And in fact, I'm cheating here a little, because what you see here is not actually what happened in the hospital. What you see here is what was supposed to happen. So what you see here is the appointment book of the whole hospital. So we have all this data. We have the appointment book data, and we have what actually happened within the hospital as read by the RTLS. And broadly speaking, the research agenda is to improve the planning based on the appointment book and to narrow the gap between the planned and the actual. So there is a gap between planned and actual. So you can see here, for example, service times, doctor exam service times, which were planned for either 15, 30, or 60 minutes. Okay, 15, 30, or 60 minutes. This is the plan. And below, what you see is the histogram of how long it actually took. So the blue goes with the blue, red was red, and green was green. So you can see that there's a very wide gap between the plan and the actual. You can also see something that is quite strange about these 3 plots. And you can see that the red and the blue are actually lying on the top of each other, which suggests that actually the hospital was not capable of classifying properly 15 versus 30 minutes visits. And indeed, when the chief medical officer of the hospital saw that, he said, why do we have short visits? You can either cancel this class, or you can actually develop better prediction or classification methods. And they actually chose to cancel the 15 minutes visits. There's also a difference between the arrival times that is planned versus actual. So what you see here is the difference between the time that you were asked to come to the hospital, to the blood test, and the time that you actually came. It's minus when you came earlier, it's plus when you came later, and the red, the blue is the data, and the red is an asymmetric Laplace distribution, which is the difference between 2 independent exponentials, not necessarily IID. That's a wonderful fit. And the reason why it fits so well is beyond us. One has to develop a model to explain that. I think this model can be done. It's going to be easier than developing a model that explains why service durations, for example, in a call center are log normal that is also something that arises quite frequently in data. So I finished with describing the type of data that we are using, and let me move on to models. And let me just say that my models, because they're mathematical models, they're necessarily simple when compared to the complex realities that they come from. Even though they're simple, the insights that they provide often is rooted in deep mathematics, and the simplicity is important if you want to achieve robustness and interpretability, but it can be actually relaxed through computational power, of course. Now, I was suggesting that maybe RANS provides a modeling framework, and this argument or this claim should be well substantiated. So I'm giving you now 6 motivations for RANS. The first motivation is to expand the modeling scope so that it will accommodate modern service systems. And my view is operational. The models are operational, and hence those systems are viewed as being demand-driven and resource scarce. Present service systems are large, they're complex, and they're data intensive. You have transaction level histories, as I showed you with the RTLS. Consequently, RANs will be dynamic. For example, they are finite horizon, but they could also be expanded to operate on an infinite horizon. They are based on many resource asymptotics to accommodate the size, large. They go beyond QNet in order to accommodate complexity, and that's why we need the input-output framework that I mentioned, the one that Harrison first developed. And the models are parsimonious in order to avoid overfitting. In fact, I will start, and the first stage of our research is developing fluid models. So the RANs that I will describe today will be all fluid models. And let me start from the end. This is the RAN master inequality. And you can see how parsimonious and how elegant it is. It's a linear system. Like I said, there is an additional conic constraint on X, but with merely 10 symbols, you can describe the dynamic of a system as complex as one wishes. And of course, I'm going to explain this master inequality later on. Second motivation. Well, it turns out that service durations in large systems are long, typically long, when compared to waiting times. So yeah, service durations are long when compared to waiting times. And that definitely happens when the large systems are well run. So for example, take call centers. You wait seconds for minutes of service. In transportation, when you search for parking, it takes you minutes, maybe 15 minutes, which looks like a long time, but the parking time parking duration is hours. And when one is hospitalized, then one waits for hours. Could be not a few hours, but still you wait for hours in order to be hospitalized for days. So you see that there is a very short waiting relative to the long service times. Now, when you think of a system from the viewpoint of conventional heavy traffic, then service durations are negligible relative to waiting time. And here the situation is the opposite, and you can see it also from data. This is data from Dana-Farber. You see here arrivals to the infusion unit, one infusion unit at the hospital. Blue is arrivals, red is departures from the queue, and green is departures from service. So the difference between the blue and the red is associated with the queuing time, and the difference between the red and the green is service times, and you see the service times are way longer. So this is an average over 53 Wednesdays, and you see also that the average describes quite well the individual days. Okay, so that's a picture that cannot be accommodated by conventional heavy traffic because the service durations are long. A theoretical motivation, the third one, consider fluid models of an MMS queue. So I want to compare the single server fluid model versus the many server fluid model as they arise from strong law of large number asymptotics. So in MMS, few servers, you have the derivative of the queue length is equal to the arrival rate minus the departure rate. And the departure rate is built as though those S servers operate in concert so that either all of them are idle or all of them are working. That's a consequence of the heavy traffic asymptotics when you have few servers. But in contrast, many server asymptotics, the change in the queue length is the arrival rate minus the departure rate, where the departure rate is proportional to the number of customers in service. So it could be, because you have many servers, 1/3 of them could be busy, 2/3 of them could be busy, and you have to take this into account when you calculate the departure rate. So this is a very different fluid model. And in fact, when you look at the departure rate from a critically loaded multi-server queue, if you look at a single server, then actually Q here is modeling the number in queue. But for 100 servers, Q models the number in service, and also the departure rates look very differently. So those models behave differently, and in fact, they represent different realities. Expanding to GGS, MMS to GGS, I want to compare single server versus many server asymptotics, strong law of large numbers. And in here, I would like to describe a non-idling GGS queue, which means that the server is idle only if the queue is empty. So single server asymptotics is based on what we call the score hog problem, that says that either if it says that the minimum bit Q and the derivative of the cumulative idleness must be 0. In words, if the Q is positive, then idleness cannot accrue, cannot increase. In contrast, many server asymptotics, it's simply the minimum between the Q and the idleness that is equal to 0, where here I is not the derivative, but in fact the amount, the number of servers that are idle. That is the amount of lost service capacity. Again, very, very different. Fourth motivation. Single, many, infinite servers, I want to accommodate all of them under a single roof. And in classical asymptotic models, heavy traffic models, one either has single or many or infinite. Oftentimes, infinite is combined with many server asymptotics. So in the classical conventional heavy traffic, typically one talks about many servers, single or few many customers, single or few servers. The analysis focuses on steady state, and fluid models are typically a tool to help establish stability, and not often more than that. Many servers, on the other hand, accommodate many customers, many server models accommodate many customers, many servers. Oftentimes, the focus is time-varying queues because the applications are server systems that are time-varying. And fluid models are models in their own right. They're not only a tool to help establish stability, but they actually are first-order tools that one starts from when one analyzes a many-server system. Now, there are also mixed heavy traffic regimes, ones that accommodate single, many, and infinite servers, that runs actually allows one. And I want to show you that in data, because real server systems, this is not really a theoretical convenience, it's actually a practical necessity. So recall the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, the patients flowing from the left to the right, starting from the blood test. And what you can see here is the blood test is, in fact, a single station with many servers. The nurses that draw blood, 15 of them typically around here. Then one moves on to the doctor. The doctors are many, in each floor are many single server queues, because each doctor is taking care of their own patients. And then moving on to the infusion, then you move again to a single many server systems, because there are about 20, over 20 infusion beds. So you see that the single, the many, and the single, and here we actually approximated it by an infinite server, actually reside under a single roof in this reality of the Dana-Farber. And we would like to accommodate that also in our models. Fifth motivation. Closed versus open. Let me make the claim that queuing theory has been mostly a theory of customers. For example, traditional open queuing networks, customers arrive, travel, queue, and leave. So the name queuing is actually associated with the fact that customers are queuing. And servers are taken for granted. They're simply there to serve the customers. I shall return to this point of servers just there waiting, just there serving customers. But let me just address the point of whether this is this really an open queuing network? So the answer is, of course, yes for customers. They arrive and leave. But the answer, I think you will agree, is a no for servers because they remain within the system. They don't consist of an open system. So in open queuing networks, customers are open and servers are closed. And in fact, all the combinations of open versus closed for customers and servers are viable and are prevalent. So open customers and closed servers in open queuing networks, closed customers and closed servers in closed queuing networks. For example, machine repair, a model that we use quite a lot in our research here. Now, customers could be open and service could be open. For example, in matching queues, this is the case, taxi models or ride hailing. And it could be also that customers are closed and servers are open. For example, in telemedicine of nursing home or in prisons, which is of course a closed population of customers when they get treated by doctors through telemedicine facilities, then doctors are not within the prison itself. And moreover, all of these are oftentimes time varying. Servers could also join or leave the shifts, and servers could be either open or closed. Servers could also be customers. For example, in a machine repair model, machines are served by customers, but machines can also serve machinists. So maybe the terminology of customers or servers is just terminology. And the way we acknowledge that is by calling all of these resources, and each such resource could be either open or closed. So this gives rise to the symmetric view of resources in RANs. All entities, capacitated entities involved in the service process are resources. Servers, but also customers, as well as equipment, room, elevators, all possibly wait for each other. Idle servers are actually waiting for customers, and each resource has its own flow itinerary within the system. And that's an important point, so let me demonstrate that by an animation. Here is a traditional view of a call center, where you model customers by a simple network. They arrive through an answering machine, they wait in queue, they get service, and then they leave. And you acknowledge also separately an agent network, where agents are either serving, they're idle, or they go on breaks. So you can actually separate this description into a customer network, a simple customer network, and a simple agent network. And that's the dynamics. Now the RAN view actually combines them. On the left, you see the customers. On the right, you see the agents. And this is where they meet for service. So this whole thing together is a depiction of a RAN. Now you can make the customer network more complex. For example, customers are various types and they can wait in various queues. You can make the servers more complex. For example, they go on breaks for various reasons. They work on paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. So here you have a complex customer network, a complex agent network, and when you put it together, you get the RAN view. Now, this is no different. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So this is the RAN view, right? Let me show you how it looks at Dana-Farber, which is a complex operation. Here you have patients, physicians, infusion nurses, exam rooms, infusion rooms, and elevators. These are all resources, and they all have their own itineraries, and they all move, of course, not independently within the system. Now, when you put it all together, you get the RAN of Dana-Farber. Okay. So the main features of RAN are their models of network activities. They're carried out by resources. Activity durations are long. They operate over finite horizon, but they could also accommodate long run or steady state. They operate in operational regimes of under, over, or critically loaded. There's a symmetric role of capacitated service enablers, which we call resources. And there are a large amount of resources, but RAN can also accommodate, if you look at it from the right point of view, they can accommodate single resources. So in fact, they're generalizing in a very rigorous way as SPNs or stochastic processing networks. And like I said, resources are closed or open or mixed. They could be, for example, closed on exit. These are the building blocks of a RAN. There are activities, J activities, there are resources, and there is the notion of a sub-resource, which is a pair of a resource being at a given state. So activities could be nurse admission, blood testing, resources are physicians, nurses, beds, etc. And a sub-resource is, for example, a patient at a state, namely after nurse admission, or a doctor that is available. The dynamics: a unit of resource follows a path of states, one at a time. Sub-resource capture the steps along the path. So sub-resource L involves resource K at a state. Activities consume sub-resources, and they produce possibly different sub-resource once completed. And sub-resources can be either engaged in activities or be unengaged. And we think of being unengaged as waiting. For example, here are RANs with one or two activities. An infinite server queue is a RAN with a single activity service and a single resource customers. There is no resource that is servers because there's infinite number of them. It's not capacitated. So there is one sub-resource arriving customers. That's very simple. A multi-server queue has a single activity and two resources, customers and servers, and there are also two sub-resources, an arriving customer and an available server. And it takes one customer and one available server to carry out the service. And it produces an available server and the customer leaves the system. Machine repairman has two activities, working and repair, two resources, machine and repairman, and three sub-resources, working machine, broken machine, and available repairman. Now, it can become very complex. For example, when you go to the hospital in Israel with the periodic checkups and you create a RAN model for it, there are more than 10 activities, there are about 15 resources, but the number of sub-resources exceeds 1,000 because they actually capture all the histories of customers within the system. So this is definitely not a mathematically tractable model. It's a model that should be analyzed through computations. The formal building blocks of a RAN, there's a lambda, G, and then CPR. Lambda is exogenous net flow, cumulative inflow minus outflow of sub-resources. So it's the sub-resource level. And it can be represented by a positive part and a negative part, both increasing corresponding to the inflow and the outflow. G, for every activity J, there is an activity duration, and Gj is its cumulative distribution function. G bar will denote the survival function of G, 1 minus G. There is a consumption matrix, CLJ, where CLJ is the amount of sub-resource L consumed by a single type J activity. So by this statement, I mean that sub-resource L, which is a pair K, state, so a resource K at a given state, consumed by an activity means that resource K is consumed at the state by activity J. There's similarly a production matrix, and part of the production remains within the system, that's a P plus, and part of the production leaves the system, that's a P minus. And there's an incidence matrix that indicates whether a sub-resource L involves resource K. RKL is equal to 1 if and only if this happens. So the incidence matrix R is allowing us to go from a very detailed sub-resource description to a more coarser resource description. So the product of RC is actually doing that, R multiplied by C. The Kj element of RC is the amount of resource K consumed by one activity J. And similar, there is RP Kj. So here's how we define, for example, closed and open resources. And it's being closed and open is not an attribute of a system, it's an attribute of an individual resource. So informally, a resource is closed if its amount within the system is constant. One actually can define closed on exit, it doesn't leave, closed on entry, it doesn't arrive, and it's closed if it's both. So for example, in generalized Jackson networks, a resource server pool is closed if staffing level is constant, else it's open. And resource customers is closed if pi is a stochastic matrix and the number is constant, else open. So the number of servers can vary in time, and you can model shifts this way. I'll have time only to show you the RAN master inequality, unfortunately. A RAN is driven by a plan. Plan is a j-dimensional function of time. Its j's coordinate is the total number of activities that started during the time 0t. It's cumulative, hence it's a non-decreasing function. It's tri-continuous left limit, so we allow jumps, and that's important for our mathematical framework and also for applications. A plan is feasible if the amount that is consumed is less equal than the amount that is available. And mathematically, it is articulated here. Fix a sub-resource L, then summing over all activities J, you get here the amount of sub-resource L consumed by activities during 0t. On the right-hand side, it's the number of activities that are available, the number of resources that are available for you to use. So let me show you how I construct that. Recall that xj is the number of activities started, cumulative number of activities started. So gj star xj is the number of activities completed. And the mathematical way of writing the number of completed activities is in terms of convolution. And you can see it here. G star x j t is, and you can represent it in several ways, but the intuition is in this representation. This is the number of activities that started at time u. And in order for these activities to be completed by time t, their service durations must be less than t minus u. And you just integrate over all u up to time t. This is the convolution. And of course, it should be familiar for those who have analyzed infinite server queues or calculated offered load in time varying environment. So gj convolution xj is the number of completed activities, and when you multiply it by the number of by p plus, then you get the amount of sub-resource L routed back to the system after activity completion. You add to it the amount of sub-resources that exogenously enter the system, and you get the RAN master inequality, written in matrix and convolution form, Cx less equal than P plus G star X plus lambda. Now, there is from this RMI follows a form that is at the level of resources, which unfortunately I don't have time to tell you about. And let me just show you a couple of examples to practice the RAN language, so you will see how you express familiar models in terms of these primitives. So the GTGSTQ has one activity and two resources. Arrivals of customers is epsilon, number of available servers is S, both of them are allowed to depend on T. Number of activities started is X, X should be less equal than epsilon, and X should be less equal than G convolution with X plus S. This constraint is due to servers, because when servers become available, finish service, they become available to serve new service starts. And these are the primitives C, P+, P-, and R for this run. So there are two resources, customers, servers, and the two sub-resources, arriving customers and available servers. And in a very similar way, you formulate a run for a generalized Jackson network. It even looks quite similar. Okay. So if I had time, which I don't, I could tell you about all these topics, and let me at least tell you what these topics are so that you will see what the run framework entails. The description that I described to you was this one-dimensional description. There was an X, even though X was indexed by activities, it was still a single dimension per activities. But oftentimes in fluid models of many server queues, the description is two-dimensional, because one talks about the residual service time, residual timing queue, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, the two-dimensional description follows from this one-dimensional description as we show. One could talk about non-idling runs in general, in analogy to a non-idling GGS queue. There's also static runs, steady state runs or long run limits of runs. One can add initial conditions so run can be in steady state. One can do what we call single resourcing of a pool of many resources in order to take a run and change at least part of it to an SPN. So for example, this naturally in the simplest case, you can take a GGS queue with many servers, and by single resourcing the servers, you turn it into a GG1 queue in conventional heavy traffic. For the machine repairman, even this simple model gives rise to a novel score hot problem. And you can take, you can actually get any SPN by starting from a run. There are interesting concepts that arise when looking at the offered load in runs. We can talk about offered load associated with staffing and offered capacity associated with appointments separately, but in a run, since everything is a resource, we have offered loads of resources or a group of resources. So the run enables you to just unify these terminologies. And we also describe the universe of free limits that lead to a single run. So there are many, many fluid models or many, many stochastic models that by taking functional strong law of large numbers will lead you to a particular run through state space collapse, etc. So one has to discuss that. And I just want to mention that in order to justify these limits rigorously, a new framework must be developed, because we're not talking about a process converging to a process. We're talking about a family of processes converging to a family of functions, and this requires different topologies, etc. Okay. Ongoing, where to from here? So a central theme, because I work with systems that many of them are driven by appointments, is to narrow the gap between the planned versus the actual. And one does that by dimensioning, scheduling, learning, predicting, computing. We're focusing now on appointment-driven large-scale service systems and runs, of course, modeling such systems, but we need to add the appointment element to it. So far, we started with the very simple run, the infinite server queue. There is a natural associated exploratory data analysis of appointment books. We have data from appointment books of Dana-Farber, as I showed you, from the Israeli parks, and also from the Israeli judicial system. And at the SEELab, we are analyzing those appointment books, which are very, very interesting. There's lots of dynamics where customers or patients cancel appointments, postpone appointments, et cetera, et cetera. So we have data on all that. And in parallel, we're developing QED theory jointly with Junfei Wang and Petar Momcilovic, both planning and scheduling appointment-driven systems. And let me finish with showing you a gap between planned and actual that goes beyond what we actually are accustomed to think of. So this is how an architect is planning an emergency department. And this is actually what the operation looks like. and that's in a hospital in Israel. These are the plans, and that's what the hospital looks like. Queues in the corridor, etc. That's the only data that is not real data. It's a simulation that is taken from a PhD thesis by an architecture student that actually joined the Technion, went back to the Technion recently, David Schaumann. What you see here is an internal ward, 36 patients, 6 doctors, 8 nurses, and 36 visitors. And David simulated the path of all these participants in the internal ward. And architects are using this in order to help them design such wards better. And they do this in addition to just capturing traveling path. They actually can map the noise that those participants in the system produce, including air conditions, for example. They actually can calculate the heat that those exert. And of course, noise and heat are related. And one can also calculate, and this is what our RTLS data is allowing us to do, social interactions among players in this operation. And this provides you with a very complete picture of the physical dimension, social dimension, and operational dimensions of the operation in order to help one design such a system so that this reality is not going to take place. Okay. I think I'm exhausted my time, so let me thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Avi. That was a tour de force. I think you just basically took, a whole bunch of very general models and showed and put them all in a context that made a lot of sense. So we'll have some virtual applause, certainly real applause in my sense, but I'm sure everyone else out there is thinking the same thing. We don't have a real lot of time, but I think it would be good if anyone wants to ask a couple of quick questions, either put your hand up, in which case you can ask it using audio, or put it in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Just give a quick question, and while someone's doing that. So Avi, you mentioned that it's all a queuing model, and your actual basic equation seems to me to be a fluid model type balance. So I've come across a whole bunch of service systems where the KPIs are in terms of tails of distributions. You've got to have 80% of people. I'm going to be talking tomorrow about a system where 80% of people got to be served within 30 seconds. So how do you actually incorporate those type of constraints, or can you, into this type of analysis?
Well, there are distributions here that are involved, right? So the run description is distribution aware, but it is still a fluid model. So there is a limited amount of information about distributions that you can get out of a fluid model. Okay, so if you want to calculate the fraction of people that has been waiting more than a certain percentage of time, you would need to refine the model and move on to the next level of diffusions.
Sure.
And that's of course in our plans, but there's a limit to what one can get from fluid models.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I think there are problems for those type of KPIs, but they do seem to be all over the place, don't they?
Of course.
Okay. We have come to, my time, 7 o'clock, but anyone else got a quick question for Avi? Okay, well, thanks again, Avi. I'm sure